Hi. Hello, Mr. DeCoco here with another video lesson. This is video lesson number 11 for Tuesday, April 28th, week of April 27th through May 1st. So I just want to briefly touch upon some things you learned about last lesson. I want to present some new material and then tell you what your assignment is. Last lesson was based on Chapter 11, Section 1. And you learned about Andrew Jackson. You learned that Andrew Jackson as a person was a tough person, poor. He was a backwoods war hero who was very popular with the public. He ended up running for president twice. He lost the first time in a very controversial election, which he referred to as the corrupt bargain. But he won the second election in a landslide, which means that he won by a lot. Jackson is going to be president for 8 years. He's going to win re-election 4 years later in 1832. In his first term as a president, Jackson stands very tough against South Carolina, which was the leading state of the southern states. South Carolina was arguing about a tariff that they didn't want to pay. They claimed it was unfair, too high, and they had the right not to pay it. They threatened to secede and break away from the United States. Jackson stood very tough. He stood firm with South Carolina and threatened to basically invade the South unless they stayed in the country and paid the tariff. So Jackson may have stopped the Civil War. He may have stopped South Carolina from breaking away from the United States. But the South never forgot this. And they held a grudge all the way to the Civil War. And some say this might have been, these were the seeds of the Civil War, possibly, that were planted in this time. So these are things you learned about last lesson. This lesson, I'm going to talk a little bit about another thing Jackson did, which he's infamous for. Infamous is another way of saying you're famous for the wrong reasons. There's being famous and there's being infamous. Jackson is infamous for his attitude and his treatment of Native Americans. And basically what I'm going to outline in the next few minutes are some things that happened while Jackson was president, which to this day Native Americans are very upset about. The first thing I'll mention is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was a law that basically forced Native Americans off their land. Now, you're probably saying, how can a law be passed to force people off their land? Well, laws are oftentimes based on, what people believe. And at that time, many Americans, especially farmers, felt that Native Americans did not make proper use of the land the same way that, say, white Americans did. Many Americans resented the fact that the natives were living on a lot of fertile farmland. They made the argument that they were better farmers and they could make better use of that land, and that the way the natives were using the land, they could just live their hunter-gatherer type lifestyle anywhere. It didn't have to be on that land. They could just go further west and do that somewhere in the west. Now, I'm not defending that. I'm just trying to help you understand why people thought the way they did back then. It wasn't fair at all, but this was the prevailing attitude of many Americans at this time. And because of that, Congress passed a law that literally forced Indians, or Native Americans I should say, off their land. Back then they called Native Americans Indians. That's why the law is called the Indian Removal Act. Now in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. Part of the Indian Removal Act said the government would pay tribes to move west. Many tribes saw the writing on the wall and they realized that this was probably the lesser of two evils. In other words, if they moved now, they could get some money at least for it. If they waited, they would eventually be kicked off their land anyway and not get any money. So most Native American tribes, not happily, felt they were forced to move, and they did. They packed their belongings and they moved westward to land where there were no white settlers living. But there was one group that decided they weren't going to do that. And by the way, before I get into this next group, the territory that they were going to was called Indian Territory. That was a section of land set aside by Congress in 1834. That land is today the present-day state of Oklahoma. And many of the eastern and southern tribes of the United States moved there. One tribe that lived in Georgia was called the Cherokee. The Cherokee